So I'm going to start off with a question about the hard problem of consciousness. Aziz asks, can we definitively say that there is a higher consciousness associated with the hard problem, or could it be science simply hasn't been able to uncover a hidden mechanism?
Did you say a higher consciousness associated?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think that's precisely the problem. That I have nothing against David Chalmers, by the way. I've discussed this issue with him in the last couple of years, and he has a very open mind. He, like his cognitive neuroscientific peers that he was critiquing the work of, took as their model example of consciousness, our consciousness. It's a sort of anthropocentrism. Why start with ours as an example of, of what we mean by consciousness? Surely, if you're wanting to understand the basic function of a biological mechanism, you go to its roots. And in the case of the reticular activating system, this is something that evolved 550 million years ago, long before cortex evolved 200 million years ago. Let alone human cortex, which comes into its own less than 1 million years ago. So I'm saying, yes, indeed, there are higher forms of consciousness. I'm sorry I wasn't able to tell you about my last case, because I tried there to show how affective consciousness governs or regulates cognitive forms of consciousness, at least in a basic way. Again, I can only say, please read my book. I explain it in detail. But the point is, I fully recognize, of course, that your consciousness and mine is very elaborated and very complicated in ways that even our closest primate relatives and our favorite pets, couldn't begin to emulate. But that form of consciousness is the wrong place to begin in terms of trying to understand its basic mechanism. And I think that we got so lost because we were looking at these higher cortical forms. In addition to that, I'm not saying only that we should have a more basic form. In addition to that, I'm saying that those higher forms, as I showed you in my talk, those cognitive processes are not inherently conscious. They don't have to be conscious. You only need to be conscious of your cognitions when you have to make choices, what we call voluntary action, where there's no existing either inborn mechanism or learnt mechanism. Once you've learned how to do something, you don't have to be conscious of it anymore. This is what learning is for. But in the learning, you have to make a decision. It's a choice. It has to be based in some value system. And I'm saying that value system biologically is good to survive, bad to die. And feelings are how the organism becomes aware of how it's doing in terms of that value system. So that's the basic form of consciousness that has to be conscious. And it's not the totality of consciousness at all. But if we understand that, we have a really important clue as to how to solve this hard problem, or at least make it a hell of a lot less hard than it appears to be.
Garth has asked, do you have examples of where brain injury has resulted in beneficial effects, either greater creativity or intellect, etc.?
I can answer that in two different ways. There are patients, actually quite a good few patients, who claim that they are better, they're more insightful, they're more in touch with what really matters, etc., than they were before their injuries. And these are sadly clinical phenomena like lack of insight. A condition called anosognosia is the extreme form, where a patient is paralyzed and denies it. As a clinician, when I hear somebody asking, can you be improved by brain injury, I'm reminded of all of those patients who for complicated cognitive and emotional reasons want to believe that they're better off, whereas in fact everyone around them doesn't think they are better off, and certainly don't feel better off themselves in having to deal with the sad, tragic consequences of brain disease. On the other hand, I've had many patients, and perhaps this is what you guys have in mind. It's not only in brain disease, but in serious. I mean, brain disease is almost always serious, but serious illness does help us to see the wood for the trees. I've had many a patient who I believe I've seen at their best and had the great privilege of being able to work with them, because they get it. They're no longer so distracted by all the materialistic and other trivia that fill up our lives. So yes, serious disease can, of course, help us to learn valuable lessons about what really matters. On the other hand, sadly, there are also specifically neurological patients of various kinds who claim that they are now more enlightened, and that's a function of their disease, I'm afraid, of their lack of insight, their inability to see things as they are. Thanks.
Fascinating, honestly. Wiley has asked about patient W, and they've asked, how do we know that he wasn't how do we know that he was having an image of the dogs and chicken? How do we know it wasn't a memory that he knows dogs should have 4 legs and chickens should have 2 legs?
Well, I think it's perfectly plausible that he has a memory that dogs should have 4 legs and chickens should have 2. But think about the actual nature of the problem I posed for him. And much more importantly, think about the nature of the answer that he gave me. It's not based on some stereotyped, automatized knowledge, that 2 dogs is 4 plus 4 makes 8. 1 chicken is a further 2. 8 plus 2 makes 10. That's the kind of thing you would expect, out of rote, stereotyped, automatized algorithms. You could come up with that. But he had the further idea. Well, those dogs might eat that chicken, and then they won't be 10. They'll be 8. There's not only an attempt at humor, a sort of a creativity and a banter with me. You have to be a person to want to banter with another person, but also the kinds of cognitive process involved. He had to see those 2 dogs eating that chicken and then say, now 10 minus 2 makes 8. That's not automatized. It's something that he came up with on the spur of the moment, on the basis of looking at the mental imagery and doing something individualized on the spur of the moment with it. So, if that was the totality of our evidence, I would say, well, yeah, you got a point, maybe, who knows? Remember, in a talk like this, I just give these little snapshots. But even that bit of evidence by itself, I think, is pretty compelling for the in support of the view that Mr. W exists as a person. There's somebody at home in the head of Mr. W, even though he has absolutely no prefrontal cortex. I will tell you one more thing. Sorry, this is really not what your question's about, but it's worth mentioning. Patients like him, patients with frontal lobe damage, they also are famously affective. They have a superabundance of feeling. And likewise, patients like Mr. B, Damasio's patient without insula, he not only had feelings, he's overwhelmed by feelings, like my patient W. And so this is a further little bit of evidence that feelings are not generated in the cortex. Cortex, as it were, inhibits or contains feelings. The feelings themselves must be generated somewhere else if there's more of it when there's less cortex. Thought I would just add that point. I know that's not what you were asking.
No, it's good. We're learning more. That kind of links to my next question about the brainstem, because I know you said a lot of it comes from there. So Nefera asks, could it be that lesions in the brainstem could affect functioning of other parts of the brain that are actually in charge of consciousness?
First of all, let me say that there's a danger in the way that I'm speaking, that I will convey the impression, that the whole mental function resides in the parabrachial nucleus, that those 2 cubic millimeters is where consciousness resides. That's a kind of localizationist fallacy, which we fell into as a discipline, precisely because you think if a function is lost with damage to a particular area, that means that function resides in that area, but that's not necessarily the case at all. As I said about the television set and the power cable, you can cut the cable and your television's gone. Doesn't mean that all of television resides in the power cable. And that is why, so I'm not claiming that. And I agree, therefore, with the sort of underlying principle in what you're saying. You're saying, well, just because lesions there lead to a loss of consciousness doesn't mean consciousness resides there. And I certainly agree that consciousness in all of its complexity requires the whole of the brain, and that the cortex plays a very important part in the rendering conscious of our visual and other extraceptive, perceptually derived forms of information processing. You can't have that kind of cognition without cortex. As I said about the little girl, no cortex at all. She can't speak. She has no possibility, not only of speaking, but of reflecting upon her experience, of even representing her experience in any cognitive form. So all of that is lost with cortical lesions. So all of that does not reside in the brainstem. So when you're saying, how do we know it isn't that the higher functions, which control the brainstem, I wouldn't say control for reasons I will explain in 1 second, but I would say interact with. Yes, it's all a very complex, dynamical, functional system. But why I'm saying that the crucial ingredient for consciousness is feeling is precisely for the range of, because of the range of evidence that I gave, that if you lesion that area, you have no consciousness. So you're quite right. It might be that the higher functions, in fact, are recruiting that lower area. And, it's not the lower area that's doing the real driving work. It could be those higher areas. Well, I showed you a patient who has no higher area in the case of the prefrontal lobes. He's still conscious, in fact, in quite interesting ways. Likewise with the insula. Likewise, patients with no cortex at all. They appear to be conscious. So it can't be that the consciousness in the affective form that I'm saying is the fundamental form is actually driven from above, because when you remove the above, it's still there. And then you might say, well, how do you know that that child is feeling? As I said, well, then you have all the other methods which show, well, it looks like the feeling is there. So in principle, I agree with you. We mustn't be localizationist and claim that the totality of these complex mental functions reside in tiny nuclei of the brain. But that doesn't mean that the different parts don't do different things. And I think that the evidence is pretty good that what the reticular activating system part does is provide raw feeling. And secondly, that without the raw feeling, all of the rest of it can't work. All of the rest of it, as far as consciousness is concerned, and you take away the higher bits, that doesn't in turn take away the lower bits. So I don't think that the causality works bidirectionally when it comes to the foundational, elemental, prerequisite form of consciousness.
Lara has asked, what is the difference between the data processing at the brain and the consciousness?
Again, I'm sorry that I wasn't able to get to my last case, because what I was wanting to illustrate with that case is, in a simple way, would have spoken to the question that you raise. So let me try in a very, very quick way. And again, of course, it's not going to properly convey the thing. But let me try and convey its essence. The essence is conveyed in the phrase that I think I used, which is that you have to feel your way into your cognition. So the cognitions are happening. They're happening automatically, unconsciously. Evidence for that is very powerful, that not only simple stereotype processes are going on unconsciously, but complex things like recognizing faces and reading words, all of that cortical stuff can go on unconsciously. So why do we ever have to feel it? So we have to literally feel it. The upper brain, the reticular activating system, the upper brain stem feels its way into these cognitions when you have to make decisions. It's the basis for choice, the basis for voluntary action, and if I can push it perhaps a little too far, the basis for free will, for deciding what you're going to do, where you decide, you have to be there, and you are literally constituted by feeling. So all this information processing is now felt by this existential thing called feeling, which is, how am I doing? Am I going to survive? Is this good for me? Is this bad for me? And so on. And that the feeling adds to the information processing, this capacity for choice grounded in a value system. Now, that really is putting it extremely simply. There's a hell of a lot more to be said about it, but that's basically what consciousness does to the information processing. The feeling states are also a form of information processing. And this is, if I had more time, I would love to talk to you about that. It's got to do with self-organizing systems. Homeostasis arose with self-organizing systems, which have an inherent aim and purpose, which is to carry on existing. And interestingly, they have this property called selfhood, self-organizing systems. They distinguish themselves, they separate themselves off from their environments, and that membrane, we call it a Markov blanket, it creates subjectivity. From then onwards, the system can only know its own states. It only knows about the outside world via its effects upon its blanket, which is, so all of that sort of stuff is also information processing of a very complex and interesting kind. Had I more time, I could go into all of that. That's why I say I'm being massively simplistic when I say, well, what feeling adds to information processing is the capacity for choice, choice being based in a value system, that value system being feelings. But that is the nub of the answer.
I mean, what I'm hearing is that we might have to invite you back to do another talk, because it sounds like there's so much to cover.
Well, Elisa, as you might have noticed, I actually quite enjoy talking, so
yes.
That won't be a painful experience for me.
So that'll be good. I've got a couple of questions about the future, as it were. So Dr. Karr asks, can quantum field theory help to explain, or in explaining, the subjective consciousness?
Well, that is a huge question. So again, I'm going to answer in a sort of embarrassingly simple way. Everything that I'm saying, remember I just said a moment ago about self-organizing systems, that these are information processing systems, that when I said that our cortical information processing needs to be felt, I don't mean that feeling is something other than information processing. Information is something absolutely fundamental. And from your question, I gather that you might be a physicist, or at least you are familiar with physics, and information is physical. You cannot explain precisely quantum phenomena without the concept of information. Think of entanglement, for example. The one particle carries information about the other particle. You cannot understand entanglement without a concept like information. So and information theory is probabilistic. So everything about the mechanisms that Carl Friston and I, in our attempts to extend our understanding of the causal mechanisms of homeostasis to the causal mechanisms of consciousness have to do with probabilities. And so to the extent that quantum physics is all about probabilistic causality, to that extent, I agree with you. But to be able to unpack all of the layers implicit in the question that you've asked would take not just an hour, probably a weekend. And I wish I could spend that weekend discussing these things with you. But I do have a couple of chapters, in fact, 3. In fact, for those of you who are not physicists, please don't despair. Chapters 7, 8, and 9. We have to go into the things that you've just asked about. If we're going to have a natural scientific account, a physical science account of consciousness, it has to be grounded in physics, in everything that we know about how the universe works. So in those 3 chapters, I go into exactly the sorts of things that you're referring to. And some readers might find it heavy going. Please don't give up, because with the vistas that open up after that in chapters 10, 11, and 12 are worth it, in my unbiased opinion.
And we have time for one last question from Atiyab, who asks, assuming that technology exists in the near future, do you think an artificial brain could recreate consciousness by recreating properly and rewiring artificial neurons in the brainstem, cortex, or HC, which I should know what that is after this talk, but I do not.
Yeah, now look, really 10 years ago, these were thought experiments. People were saying, well, if you have a brain, it's just neurons, and you can engineer a silicon neuron, which does performs the same function as an individual neuron. And so here you have a silicon brain where each element is doing the same thing as in the natural brain, and you slowly replace one natural neuron with one silicon neuron, then slowly but surely you will create an entirely silicon brain, which has the same functional organization as the natural brain, and then that silicon brain must perform the same function and therefore must be conscious. As I say, that was a thought experiment. In recent years, first of all, we actually do have silicon neurons. They are fully functional artificial neurons which perform exactly the function that a pyramidal neuron, a corticospinal neuron, performs. But leaving aside that, we don't even need to have silicon neurons. We have practical, concrete studies where the function of a pyramidal neuron, say, as I said, one type of pyramidal neuron is corticospinal, where there's a lesion in the corticospinal tract, so that the monkeys in this experiment, and again, I always feel so sorry for these animals, but these studies have been done and they have massive implications for clinical medicine in humans. The monkey is trying to send a signal from the pyramidal neurons in its motor cortex to its leg to do something, but it can't because the pyramidal neuron is severed. So in this study, a micro array is placed over the cortex, recognizing that signal, transducing it into a radio signal, sent to a receiver in the lower spinal cord, which then performs the function, and the monkey's leg moves. And I don't just move, I mean, the monkey walks functionally over uneven surfaces. So the function can be performed artificially. So this is no longer a thought experiment. And I'm just giving you one example. This is really not an isolated case. The functions of neurons can be performed not only in silicon, but even by radio signals. It's just information. So in principle, yes, not only in theory can it be done, but the basics have already been done when it comes to motor neurons. Pyramidal neurons that perform motor functions are no different in their essence than pyramidal neurons that perform cognitive functions. Now, I want to take that one step further, and this, I know we're out of time, so it'll be the last thing that I'm saying. I'm saying, and that's answering your question, but I'm going one step further because I really think this is important. That if we have, you saw the equations that Carl Friston and I worked out for this extended form of homeostasis that we call feeling. If those truly are the causal mechanisms whereby feeling is generated, then it must be possible to engineer it. I mean, 10 years ago, I would never have dreamt that I would say such a thing. But you have to follow the facts and the evidence to its logical conclusion. I'm saying if we're really wanting to claim that we now have a causal account, a causal natural physical science account of how feeling works causally, then we should be able to produce it artificially. And if we can't do that, then we're not quite there yet. So it's not only that I think we're on the brink of being able to do that, I'm saying that unless we can do that, we haven't solved the problem.